Hello and welcome back. In our last lesson, 5.1 part 4, we finished off by graphing the function that is shown. So I'm going to pick up here and then we will continue on with our 5.1 lesson. So we are asked to determine the amplitude, period, horizontal shift, and then this should be the midline of our function. So if we remember, our coefficient on our cosine function is going to give us our amplitude. So my amplitude, A, in this graph is going to be 4. The period of this function and the horizontal shift I'll come back to in a moment. The midline of our graph is going to occur at our k value, which in this case is -3. So the midline occurs at y equals -3. So if I just quickly sketch these two things on my graph, I've got a midline at -3, so 1, 2, 3. My midline will be here at this horizontal line. Now my amplitude is 4, which means that we are going to go up 4 from our midline. So I go up to +1. This will be where the maximum of my graph is. And my minimum will occur 4 units below my midline, which would be approximately here. So my graph is going to be bounded between the max and the min. So my graph will take place between these two y values. Now to identify my period and my horizontal shift, I am just going to focus on the input to that cosine function. So I'm just focusing on the 2t plus pi over 2. To identify my period and my horizontal shift, if there is a coefficient on that t value, that will tell us what our period is. But in order to identify the horizontal shift, I need to factor out that coefficient from the rest of my expression. So factoring out a 2 from 2t, when I divide 2t by 2, I get just t plus, and then factoring out a 2 from pi over 2 means that I need to take my pi over 2 and divide it by 2. Or in other words, I take my pi over 2 and I multiply, instead of dividing, by the reciprocal, which would be 1/2, which leaves me with pi over 4. So when I factor out a 2 from pi over 2, I'm left with pi over 4. So this tells me that my period is going to be 2 pi over that b value, which is 2, or the period is pi. So this 2 tells us how many cycles we complete in our 2 pi interval, which means that we are going to be completing 1 cycle in pi units. My horizontal shift, since I'm adding a pi over 4, my horizontal shift is going to be to the left pi over 4. So from here I'm going to go ahead and label my x-axis. Since we're shifting to the left pi over 4 units, I'm going to go ahead and count by pi over 4. So pi over 4, this will be pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and pi. This is 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, which would be 3 pi over 2, 7 pi over 4, and 8 pi over 4, which would be 2 pi. Going to the left, I'll have pi over 4 and negative pi over 2. Here I would have -3 pi over 2, so my next interval would be -4 pi over 2 or negative pi. So I know that my graph is going to start at my midline. Since we are graphing the cosine function reaches a maximum at the point where x is 0. So I will have a maximum value where x equals 0. From there, my period is only pi, which means I complete a full cycle in that pi unit. So I'm going to reach another maximum here at pi. So cosine has a max at 0, and then normally it would have its next max or complete a cycle in 2 pi, but here, since our period is just pi, it completes its cycle at pi. So that means that halfway in between the two maximum values at pi over 2, it will reach its minimum value, which would be -7. Halfway in between the max and the min, it does need to cross through my midline. So that means at pi over 4, it's going to cross through my midline. And then halfway in between pi over 2 and pi, it needs to also cross my midline. So that would be at 3 pi over 2. So one cycle of this cosine graph without my horizontal shift is going to look something like this. So then my next cycle is going to follow that similar shape. My next max is going to occur in another pi unit, so at 2 pi, which means my minimum occurs halfway in between at 3 pi over 2. Halfway in between the max and the min, so that's going to be at 5 pi over 2. I'm going to cross through my midline again. And halfway in between the minimum and the maximum, which would be at 7 pi over 4, it's going to cross through my midline again. So I cross through and complete my second cycle. From here, the only thing I haven't considered is my horizontal shift. So I considered my amplitude, so my graph goes up 4 from the midline and down 4 from the midline. I considered that my midline is at y is -3. I considered that my period is pi. Need to now consider that my horizontal shift is going to be to the left, pi over 4 units. So since every increment on my x-axis is pi over 4, I'm going to take all of those points that I graphed and simply just move them 1 unit to the left. So I take this point on my midline, 1 to the left, my minimum, 1 to the left, 1 to the left, 1 to the left, or in other words, pi over 4 to the left, pi over 4 to the left, pi over 4 to the left, and pi over 4 to the left. And then graphing my function, I hit my maximum, cross through my midline, hit my minimum, cross through my midline, my max, midline, my minimum, midline, and then my maximum. So I start a cycle here, end a cycle here. There's my first full cycle. Then I start my second cycle here, and I end my second cycle here. So I have completed 2 full periods of my graph of this cosine function. One typo that you may have noticed is that this is asking us to graph 2 times the cosine of our function, but this should actually be a 4, so that we are graphing the function from above. I'd like you to go ahead and take a moment now to pause the video and attempt identifying the amplitude, period, horizontal shift, and midline, again this is a typo, and midline of our function from the graph that's shown to the right. Once you have all that information, I would like for you to go backwards with that information and write your formula using the values that you identified for A, B, H, and K. So go ahead and take a moment to pause the video and try doing that on your own before I lead you through it. To identify my midline, I'm going to look at my maximum, which is 1, and my minimum, which is -5, and find the point that is in the middle of that max and that min. So I will start by adding my -5 and my 1. So my midline equals my minimum, which is -5, plus my max, which is 1, then divided by 2. I get -4 over 2, which is a -2. So my midline occurs on the line y equals -2. So I identified my midline. From there I can easily identify my amplitude. So my amplitude starts at -2 and goes up 1, 2, 3 units. And just to check, I'm going to make sure that we go down units to get to our minimum. So starting at -2, I go down 1, 2, 3, and sure enough I do get to my midline, or my minimum. So my amplitude is going to equal +3. From here, I need the period and the horizontal shift. So my period of this graph looks like I start at 1 and I end my cycle at 7. So my period is equal to 6. And then the horizontal shift, if I look at this as a cosine function, generally cosine has its peak at 1, 0 on that x-axis and 1 on my y-axis, which means that I have shifted everything over to the right 1 unit. So my horizontal shift is going to be right by 1 unit. So with all that information in mind, I can identify my amplitude A, which is 3. My midline is my k value, so k in this case is a -2. My horizontal shift is to the right 1 unit, so h is going to be a +1, the positive representing that we are shifting to the right. Now I need to find my b value. We have talked about our period formula being 2 pi divided by b. B is how many cycles you complete in that 2 pi period. Well, my period is 6, so that means that I have 6 equaling 2 pi over b. And solving for b, I will multiply both sides by b. To get 6 times b is equal to 2 pi. To solve for b, I will divide by 6 and then reduce that fraction on the right. So b is equal to pi over 3. Putting all of this together, I did look at this as a cosine function, so I'm going to use the cosine form here. My y value is going to equal a, my amplitude, which is 3, times the cosine of b, which we found was pi over 3, multiplied by x minus my horizontal shift, which is a +1, plus my k value, which is a -2, so plus a -2 or -2. This would be the equation for the graph that is shown above. And that would be part C. To check your equation, you can always go to Desmos.com or search in Google Desmos graphing. And input your equation to the graphing calculator. When you do so, your graph is going to look something like this, which does have that vertex or that maximum value at 1. It has a minimum value at 4. I see that the maximum value is 1, and the minimum value over here at 4 is a -5. I see that that midline is at a -2, and that we shifted my graph to the right 1 unit, just like was shown in our graph in our notes. Now our very last example is going to be an application. So we have a Ferris wheel that has a diameter of 135 meters, or 443 feet. It completes 1 rotation every 30 minutes. Riders board the platform 2 meters above the ground. Express the rider's height above the ground as a function of time in minutes. So I have provided the graph for us, so we are just going to write the equation of this graph. So the rider's height when they board is 2 meters. So their lowest point when they're on the Ferris wheel is 2 meters. Their highest point when they are on this Ferris wheel is going to be 137 meters. And the reason it's 137 is because the diameter of my Ferris wheel is 137. So from where they board straight up for the top, this is 135 meters, but they boarded 2 meters above the ground, which brings this point to a height of 137. They board at 0 minutes and complete their full rotation at 30 minutes, so I have a cycle with a period of 30 minutes. The midline is going to be halfway in between 2 and 137, so that would be at 69.5, and we find that by just adding the max and the min and dividing by 2. So from here, go ahead and take a moment to pause the video and write the equation to the best of your ability. You can go ahead and take a moment to check your work with mine. Thanks so much for watching.